March 24, 1944, Sagan, in the German province of Lower Silesia. The temperature has dropped well below freezing, and a thin crust of frost covers the sandy soil beneath Stalag Luft III. Somewhere under Hut 104, 30 meters down, a wooden trapdoor swings open with a soft click, and a man in a converted RAF greatcoat lowers himself into a shaft barely wide enough for his shoulders. Above him, more than 200 officers wait in the darkness of the barracks, dressed in clothing stitched from blankets and dyed with boot polish, carrying forged papers, hand-drawn maps, and compasses fashioned from melted gramophone records. Somewhere further off, a guard's torch beam sweeps across the wire, and for a moment, everything stops. This single night, more than any battle fought that spring, would come to define what escape meant inside a German prisoner of war camp, and why an entire clandestine organization had spent the better part of a year building a tunnel most engineers would have called impossible. To understand why that night mattered, you first have to understand what a Stalag Luft actually was, and why the camp at Sagan represented something the Luftwaffe had specifically designed to prevent this exact outcome. Stalag Luft III opened in the spring of 1942, purpose-built to hold captured Allied airmen, and the site was chosen with deliberate care. The camp sat on sandy yellow subsoil that collapsed easily and showed up starkly against the darker topsoil if dug and dumped carelessly, making tunneling both structurally treacherous and visually risky. The huts were raised on stilts, well clear of the ground, so guards could see beneath them. Seismograph microphones were buried around the perimeter to detect digging. Ferrets, plain-clothed guards trained specifically to search for tunnels, moved through the compound at all hours, sometimes hiding under huts to listen for the scrape of a shovel. On paper, Sagan was meant to be the camp from which escape was, in the words of the Germans who ran it, essentially unachievable. The problem facing the prisoners then was not simply how to get outside the wire. Earlier escape attempts across occupied Europe had shown that a single tunnel, however well built, rarely succeeded, because the Germans only needed to find one exit shaft to shut the entire operation down and punish everyone involved. By 1943, more than 2,000 officers were held at Sagan, many of them experienced escapers already transferred there specifically because German intelligence considered them persistent troublemakers. Roughly 1 in 3 had already attempted escape from another camp. The organizers, led by squadron leader Roger Bushell, understood that a modest, opportunistic dig would not be enough. They needed a scheme so large, so mathematically improbable, that even the camp's formidable security could not realistically stop it. Bushell's plan called for not 1 tunnel but 3, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry, each starting from a different building, so that if the Germans discovered one, the escape organization, known inside the camp as the X organization, could continue work on the others without the enemy suspecting a second or third shaft even existed. It was an almost absurd level of ambition for men living on starvation rations behind barbed wire, and that, in itself, was the point. The tunnel that eventually succeeded, Harry, began beneath a stove in Hut 104 and ran roughly 102 meters to a patch of woodland just beyond the perimeter fence. Digging a tunnel of that length through loose, collapsing sand required an almost industrial level of organization, and the X organization built exactly that. Around 600 prisoners, out of the camp's total population, contributed in some capacity, though only a small number actually dug. Wooden bedboards, roughly 200 per tunnel, were quietly stripped from bunks across the camp to shore up the walls and ceiling, a theft so widespread that guards eventually noticed prisoners sleeping on ever thinner slats and could never quite work out why. An air pump built from kit bags, tin cans, and hockey sticks forced fresh air along a pipeline of dried milk tins down the shaft, since a man digging 30 meters underground in a space barely a meter high would otherwise suffocate before he ever reached open ground. Electric lighting, tapped illegally from the camp's own power supply, ran the length of the tunnel on cable smuggled in through bribed guards and forged requisition slips. A miniature railway, built from scavenged wood, allowed diggers to haul sand back to the entrance shaft on small wheeled trolleys, since a man could not crawl 100 meters dragging a sack behind him in a space that narrow. Getting rid of the excavated sand was, if anything, a harder problem than the digging itself. The bright yellow subsoil could not simply be dumped in the compound without giving the whole operation away, so prisoners devised a system using trouser legs rigged with drawstrings, nicknamed penguins, who would shuffle around the exercise yard, letting the sand trickle out through small holes as they walked, scattering it thinly enough to blend with the surface dust. Roughly 25,000 kilograms of sand, by some estimates, was dispersed this way across the camp over the course of the dig, a staggering quantity moved essentially by hand, one trouser leg at a time. Behind the digging itself sat an equally vast forgery and tailoring operation. A team nicknamed the Penguins for supply, the tailors, and the forgers, worked to produce more than 400 sets of civilian clothing from dyed and altered uniforms, alongside hundreds of forged travel permits, identity documents, and rail passes, each one copied by hand from genuine German paperwork that had been bribed, stolen, or photographed. Compasses were manufactured from broken razor blades and magnetized sewing needles, their faces painted with luminous paint scraped from clock hands. Nothing about this resembled a single desperate dash for the wire. It resembled, in miniature, a functioning wartime intelligence and manufacturing operation, run entirely by men with almost no tools, no freedom of movement, and constant surveillance. By the night of March 24, 1944, Tunnel Harry was finally ready, and 200 men had been selected, through a mixture of merit and lottery, to attempt the breakout. The plan called for exits every few minutes through the night, aiming to get as many as 200 officers clear of the camp before dawn. Almost immediately, things began to go wrong. The tunnel surfaced short of the tree line, leaving the exit exposed and visible to a nearby guard tower rather than hidden in the woods as intended. Each man had to wait for the tower's searchlight to sweep past before scrambling out, slowing the pace of escape dramatically. An air raid blackout plunged the camp into darkness at a critical moment, and a collapse partway through the night further delayed the queue of men crawling underground in near-total blackness, passing sand and equipment hand-to-hand along the line. What had been planned as a mass breakout of 200 men slowed, hour by hour, into a nerve-shredding trickle. By the time a guard discovered the exit shaft, in the small hours of March 25th, 76 men had made it out into the Silesian night, dressed as laborers, businessmen, and neutral country travelers, carrying forged papers and scraps of food hoarded from Red Cross parcels over many months. Only 3, Dutch airman Bram van der Stok and Norwegians Per Bergsland and Jens Muller, reached genuine safety, traveling by train and on foot through occupied territory before crossing into neutral countries. The remaining 73 were recaptured within days, hunted across the German countryside by an enormous manhunt involving police, soldiers, and local civilians, in weather cold enough to kill an exhausted man in the open within hours. Of those recaptured, 50 were shot on the direct orders of Adolf Hitler in violation of the Geneva Convention, a war crime for which several of the officers responsible were later tried and executed. It remains one of the starkest illustrations of just how seriously the German High Command regarded the embarrassment of the escape, and how disproportionate the retaliation against unarmed prisoners could be. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more of this story still to come. Seen alongside German and American escape efforts of the same period, the ambition behind Harry stands out sharply. German prisoners held in British and Canadian camps attempted their own tunnels, most famously at Camp O2O and various sites across Canada, but rarely on anything approaching this scale of organization, partly because Allied camp security, while serious, did not match the almost fanatical countermeasures the Luftwaffe employed at Sagan, and partly because German prisoners in Allied hands generally expected the war to end in their favor and had less incentive to risk a bullet in the back for a temporary taste of freedom. American airmen held in the same North Compound at Sagan and later at the neighboring South Compound contributed extensively to the X organization before many were moved elsewhere in 1944, and their engineering and resourcefulness, particularly in metalwork and the construction of the air pump, were essential to the entire scheme. What distinguished the British-led effort was less any single technical innovation than the sheer scale of coordination, the willingness to sacrifice months of grinding, invisible labor for a plan that always carried a significant chance of ending in a shallow German grave. Nothing built by Axis prisoners elsewhere in the war approached the combination of tunnel length, forged documentation, and sheer manpower mobilized beneath Sagan. The material impact of the Great Escape, as the operation became known, was almost negligible in strict military terms. 73 recaptured men and 3 successful escapes did not shift the balance of the war, and the tunnel itself, along with the elaborate infrastructure built to support it, was destroyed within days of its discovery. The psychological impact, however, was considerable and ran in both directions. For the Germans, the escape and the scale of the organization behind it exposed serious failures in camp security and diverted enormous resources, including police, soldiers, and Gestapo units, into a manhunt across the Reich at a moment when Germany could ill afford the distraction. For the prisoners who remained, and for Allied airmen elsewhere who heard of it through camp grapevines and coded letters home, the escape stood as proof that resistance behind the wire remained possible, that captivity did not have to mean passivity, and that ordinary men with almost nothing could still build something formidable enough to genuinely frighten their captors. The murder of the 50 officers, when it became known after the war through a dedicated RAF investigation that tracked down and prosecuted many of those responsible, transformed the episode from a story of ingenious escape into one of the clearest documented war crimes committed against Allied prisoners, and it directly shaped how the Geneva Conventions were strengthened after 1945 regarding the treatment of recaptured prisoners of war. Today, the site of Stalag Luft III lies within modern Sagan in Poland, where a museum stands close to the original camp boundary, and visitors can walk the ground above where Tunnel Harry once ran, its route now marked out for those who want to trace, meter by meter, just how far beneath the frozen soil these men dug. Fragments of the original tunnel structure, along with tools, forged documents, and personal items recovered from the site, are held in the museum's collection, alongside memorials to the 50 officers murdered in the aftermath. Return for a moment to that trapdoor beneath Hut 104 and the man lowering himself into 30 meters of freezing darkness on the last night the tunnel would ever be used. He did not know, as he crawled forward on his hands and knees along a shaft barely wider than his own shoulders, that of the 200 men who hoped to follow him that night, only 76 would reach the open air and only 3 would ever see home again. He did not know that 50 of his fellow officers, men who had spent the better part of a year stealing bedboards, dyeing greatcoats, and forging travel permits by candlelight, would be dead within weeks, shot in 2s and 3s on quiet roadsides across occupied Europe. What he did know, crawling forward through sand that could collapse without warning at any moment, was that the alternative, simply waiting out the war behind wire that had been specifically built to hold him, was no longer a future he was prepared to accept. That, in the end, is what the last night inside Stalag Luft III actually proved. Not that escape guaranteed survival, because for most of the 76 who made it out, it did not. Not that the tunnel itself changed the course of the war, because in purely military terms, it barely registered. What it proved was something harder to measure and, in its way, more enduring. That even inside a camp engineered specifically to make defiance impossible, on sandy soil chosen because nothing could be dug through it undetected, ordinary men found a way to dig anyway, for 102 meters, in the dark, for the better part of a year, simply because the alternative was to accept that they had already been beaten. 76 men crawled out of that tunnel. 50 never came home. and the tunnel itself, filled in and forgotten by the war that swallowed it, still runs beneath that quiet Polish field today, 102 meters of proof that captivity was never quite the same as surrender.